Can I ask you, the Prime Minister on July 29 announced draft words in relation to a question to be put to the Australian people in the referendum in relation to the voice, and so there were draft words to be added to the Constitution. Did the Attorney General's Department provide advice with respect to the formulation of those draft words?
Those words were very similar to some words that have been developed by a number of different formulations that have been developed by a number of groups and have been publicly available for a number of years.
Okay, so let's park that. I understand that. My particular question is, what advice did the Attorney General's Department provide? What role did the Attorney General's Department provide? Did they carry out with respect to the drafting of those words?
Our department didn't provide any advice on the drafting of those particular words.
So just to get this clear, the Attorney General's Department did not provide any advice with respect to the draft words to be added to the Australian Constitution that were announced by the Prime Minister on July 29. Is that correct?
That's correct. And as you know, when the Prime Minister announced those words, he said this is a draft for discussion, and there's been public discussion about that draft, and I expect there'll be further discussion before the draft is finalised.
But there was no advice provided by the Attorney General's Department with respect to the draft words, albeit for discussion, to be added to the Constitution that were announced by the Prime Minister on 29 July.
That's correct.
That's correct. Minister, does that surprise you that the Attorney General's Department wasn't asked to actually give advice with respect to the drafting of words to be inserted in the Australian Constitution before they were announced by the Prime Minister?
It's not for me to talk about being surprised or not. You've had the evidence from the officials.
Did the Attorney provide any advice with respect to those draft words?
I'd have to take that on notice.
Can you take that on notice, please? And similarly, did the Department provide any advice or input in relation to the draft referendum question, which was announced by the Prime Minister on 29 July?
No, Senator.
So no advice was provided by the Attorney General's Department in relation to the draft referendum question, which was announced by the Prime Minister on 29 July. Is that correct?
That's correct. We didn't provide any advice to the Prime Minister about that question.
I find that extraordinary, Minister.
Well, it's important to recognise, Senator Scarr, that these are proposed words that have been put forward by the Prime Minister. They're not necessarily the finished product. And the Prime Minister, when he made his announcement, referred to them as a starting point. And we welcome discussion and contributions from all members of the public, and I'd encourage you to put your own suggestions forward, Senator Scarr.
Well, the Prime Minister
You're a
didn't
lawyer.
consult me. I didn't necessarily expect the Prime Minister to consult me, but can I say to you, Minister,
as you know,
sorry, let me finish, Minister. I would expect that the Prime Minister, before tabling, given the significance of the Prime Minister tabling an amendment to our Constitution, would actually seek advice from the Attorney General's Department with respect to the wording of the proposed amendment to the Constitution, the wording of the referendum question. So I'm absolutely staggered. I'm gobsmacked, to be frank, that the advice of the Attorney General's Department was not considered, was not asked for prior to the announcement of those draft words.
Well, as I say, Senator Scarr, we would welcome your contribution to these words, as we would the opposition leaders. We're waiting for the opposition leader to tell the Australian public what the opposition's position is on the voice to Parliament. The Prime Minister put these words forward.
Well, with respect, Minister, you're deflecting from the key point, which is the Attorney General's Department has a key responsibility with respect to constitutional law in this country, and they were not even asked for their opinion with respect to the draft words to be inserted in the Constitution.
Well,
it is extraordinary, don't you think?
Well, I think
Don't you believe that?
Well, would you like me to answer?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Not deflect, answer.
Senator
Well,
Scarr.
now's when I get to answer.
Yeah, sure.
Are you ready?
Do your best.
Senator Scarr.
Are you ready?
Yeah,
You're not going to interrupt?
I'm waiting.
Minister, just answer the question.
As I have said, when the Prime Minister made his announcement about the proposed words, they are merely that, proposed words, and he invited Australians to have their say. I know your government doesn't have a history of cooperating with state governments, territory governments, the public, industry groups, unions, First Nations people, but we do. And we are doing this in a consultative manner, inviting the wider Australian public to put forward their views about the proposed wording. We will listen to those views, and over the next period of time, the words will be settled, having listened to the Australian public, and you as a lawyer, any other lawyer, anyone from the Attorney-General's Department, anyone at all can have their say, and I think that's a healthy thing.
Senator,
Could I ask a follow-up question?
could I
Sure.
just one additional point to note for the senator? The government has established a constitutional expert group to provide legal advice and assistance to the referendum working group that has been established by the government to engage with First Nations people to help the process. So the constitutional expert group is comprised of a range of eminent constitutional lawyers. The attorney met with that group, as did Senator Dodson, on the 28th of October. The department has been supporting the Attorney-General in terms of his engagement with the constitutional expert group, and we anticipate that it will meet a number of times to support the government in determining the most appropriate final wording for the referendum.
So, Ms Jones, can I ask you this?
Senator
I
Scarr,
don't think
just
the cash
in
has
terms
got
of
it.
timing, this is you're coming up to your last question.
Well, this is a really important issue,
That's
Chair.
fine. You can come back
So,
to it. That's
well,
the
we may
beauty
well
of
have
estimates.
to come back to it.
Yep.
But can I ask you, Ms Jones, your department has got a great deal of capacity and capability with respect to issues relating to the Constitution of Australia, hasn't it? Is that correct?
I'm of the view, yes.
Or am I
with
missing
Mr.
something?
Lewis, yes.
So they would have had capacity, and they would be probably some of the preeminent experts in the country who could provide input with respect to something as fundamental and important as drafting words for an amendment to the Constitution. Isn't that correct?
Well, what I would say is through our support of the Constitutional Expert Group engagement, we are providing that support and advice.
3 months after these words were issued.
These are not final words, Senator Scarr. This is a proposal that the Prime Minister has put forward that he is inviting public commentary on, and Ms Jones has made clear that there is a constitutional expert group who will be advising the government on all of these matters.
Why wouldn't you get the input of the department before releasing the words?
Senator Scarr, I am handing the call over.